So we're moving into the final session for the day, which is stakeholder engagement, making it happen. So this is all of the so what part. So I'd like to welcome back Rachel Carey from the University of Melbourne. Melbourne's Food Future Planning, a Resilient Food Bowl, Stakeholder Engagement. So welcome, Rachel.
Okay, thank you very much. So in my first presentation this morning, I really talked about the basics of the case study of the Foodprint Melbourne project, what it was that we'd tried to do, and some of the key findings that are of relevance to you here in Perth. What I'm going to talk about now is more of the how we've gone about actually doing this project. And with the how, I'm not going to talk about the detail of our research methods. I'm actually going to talk about something that's really far more important, the effectiveness of this project, which is the project's focus on stakeholder engagement and the project's focus on communication as well. And they've been absolutely fundamental to this project. And just to give you a feeling for how important they've been, I've been working on this issue for about 8 years now, advocating to various policymakers on the issue with, I would say, unfortunately, relatively little impact. So we've been producing some of the typical kinds of outputs, I guess, research reports, policy briefings, those kinds of things. The Foodprint Melbourne project has been a game changer for us from that point of view. And there's two things that we've really tried to do with this project that have been different. One is to generate a solid evidence base about Melbourne's food system, about what was growing on the city fringe and about how important that is to the city's food security. But I think we all know in this room that while it would be very nice to think that policy was generally evidence-based and that if we produce the evidence that was going to, change people's minds, we all know that evidence basically does not change hearts and minds, unfortunately. So, and we've all got many examples of that. So one of the other key things that's been absolutely vital in this project is to learn how to use the evidence to tell really good stories, basically, because it's stories that actually change hearts and minds. And that's one of the things that we've done that's been really powerful in this project, and that's one of the things that I want to talk to you about and give you some examples of exactly how we've been going about that work. So I mentioned this morning that we have a stakeholder advisory group for this project and that it's aimed to be highly relevant to stakeholders. And just to remind you, this is a research-driven project. It's not something that's been commissioned by a group of stakeholders, although that's also an excellent model. And in fact, the Sydney Food Futures project has worked much more in that kind of way. But for us, it was a research-driven project, but we have really been engaging stakeholders from the very start. So we set up this stakeholder advisory group, and I want to tell you a little bit more about how it runs. All of the organisations on our stakeholder advisory group are represented up here, and the project funder also sits on the stakeholder advisory group. And that's actually been really important because the project funder, the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, was really trying to understand how they could have impact in the sustainable food system space. So they have sat on that advisory group as much as anything as a way of learning what it was they needed to be funding, and we've really kind of opened up to a very close relationship with them. And the benefit of that, of course, has been that they've continued to fund the work because they're entirely on the journey with us. Not only have they done that, but they've actually they're also quite instrumental in something that's been established called the Sustainable Food System Funders Group, which actually includes a whole lot of philanthropic organisations in Australia who are just starting on this journey of trying to understand how they can best intervene to support more sustainable food systems. So they're a really important part of this process. So we've met with the stakeholder advisory group every few months during the project. They've helped us to shape the project in the sense of the questions that we're asking about this project, making sure we're identifying relevant research questions, interpreting what the findings mean, why the findings are significant to them, what impact or influence could those findings have. They have helped us interpret how we should ask new questions based on the findings that are coming out of this project. They've sent us back to the drawing board sometimes when there were key parts of that story that were missing, and that was really important too for them to be pointing out those gaps and sending us back to fill them in. This group has also helped us to understand how to communicate with stakeholders about the findings that were coming out of the project and how to help to ensure that this evidence base could actually influence policy. And I will say we're a little bit hesitant about working with the group in such a close way, but it has been one of the things that's been most effective about the project, and we'll continue to do that for the subsequent stages of the project. And it's probably also testament to the engagement that they've had, that all of the key stakeholders want to continue to work on future phases of the project. And the problem with this has not been to engage stakeholders. The problem is that we have stakeholders actually getting in touch all the time, wanting to be involved in that kind of way, and it's difficult to manage, and that's why we work through the peak bodies as well. There was, though, another key reason why it was really important to engage these stakeholders, and that is that we wanted to lay the groundwork for a shared vision and a groundwork that would help them to take collective action afterwards. Now, one of the issues in Victoria is that we do not have a governance mechanism, a formal governance mechanism, that enables those city and those local governments in the metropolitan region to work effectively together. So lacking that formal mechanism, like we have in the UK, so for Greater Manchester or Greater London, they have a formal governance mechanism. We don't have that for Greater Melbourne. So we really wanted to lay the groundwork to enable them to start working together on the issue as well. So we really needed to bring those stakeholders on the journey with us. And in terms of where we've got to at the end of the first stage of the project, which is what I talked about in the previous presentation, I think we've got to the stage where we've developed a shared understanding of some of the key issues, at least in an informal sense, even if we don't have formal agreements yet in place. And in the next stage of the project that I'm going to talk about shortly, we're going to work with these stakeholders to develop a shared vision for what we want in terms of this resilient city food bowl and a roadmap for achieving that vision. So I'm going to come back and talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. But first of all, I'm going to tell you more about our engagement framework. We've also worked very hard to engage more broadly beyond our immediate stakeholder base so we can keep a bigger group of stakeholders informed about what it is that we're doing and constantly extend that stakeholder base. So every time that we release new findings, we send out a project newsletter that stakeholders can sign up for, and we've now got over 750 stakeholders on that project newsletter, all keeping in touch with what's happening on the project. We can see who's on that newsletter, we can see who's opening those newsletters, what it is they're reading and looking at. We can see that we have representatives of many key state government departments as well as local governments and other stakeholders on there as well. The project's always had its own web pages, but it's shortly going to have its own website launched as well, because the resources that we're developing from this project are really extending. It's also been very important for this project to go beyond engaging with the immediate key stakeholders and to engage the general public. So we've done this through social media particularly, and through using the mainstream media as well. This is an infographic that came out of the pilot that we did before the Foodprint Melbourne project. It's called Know Your Food Bowl. And these maps were actually the main output from that project. We didn't produce reports at all. We had some statistics we put up on our website. This was from a $10,000 crowd-funded project where we really learned how to talk to the public about these issues. And we produced this map that was quite widely shared, also ended up in media articles, and was excellent for going and talking to policymakers as well. But there's a few reasons why we need to engage with the general public. Firstly, as I've already said, producing the evidence just isn't enough. And I see part of our role as researchers as also creating the social and political license for action to be taken on the issue. So we meet with politicians who would like to act, but can only act if it's an issue with the general public. So they need people to be talking about the issue. We have to create that license to act. I also mentioned there's been very low awareness of the importance of city fringes as food growing spaces. I do a lot of media on this, and after several years, the question that I'm asked most often by the media is still, do I think people are going to be surprised to find out how much food is growing on the city fringe? We're still there. We're still in that space of just trying to communicate to people that these are food growing spaces. And also, and finally, but still very importantly, there is always going to be pressure for development on the urban fringe. Even when we've got new policy mechanisms in place, that pressure will continue. And we've seen that in other cities, some of the Canadian cities that have very effective policy mechanisms in place. they still have attempts to undermine those policy mechanisms. So if we're going to hold the line in future in the long term, we need the general public to understand the importance of protecting those areas of farmland and of also supporting our local farmers on the city fringe. We've got to develop a high level of public understanding. And that's why we've really worked with using these kinds of infographics in that way. We found images to be very powerful, a very powerful way of communicating the issues to the general public and to our stakeholders, to politicians, policymakers, and communicating both the issues and the solutions. We've continued to produce infographics throughout the Foodprint Melbourne project, and we'll be producing these infographics through the next stage of the project too. Over the first 2 years of the Foodprint Melbourne project, we released 3 major reports, 3 infographics, and 2 summary briefings. What did this do? Well, firstly, this allowed us to communicate the issues in different ways and to stage the release of our findings so that each of the reports, infographics, and briefings was released at a different time. So that had a number of benefits. Each time we released findings, we're able to go to the media with a new story and new messages about the issue, and we're able to build that story up over time. It also enables us to chunk up what are very complicated, very complex findings. We've already talked about how difficult it is to communicate these issues to the general public. This is a project with a very big evidence base, and much of it would have been completely lost in communications if we tried to go out with one final report at the end. So by staging the release of these different types of outputs through the 2 years of the project, what that enabled us to do was to build this public conversation about the issue. And look, we were a little hesitant at the start. We wondered if we'd shoot ourselves in the foot media-wise by releasing too much early on. But what we found as the conversation built, it developed its own momentum. So now what's happening over the last year, we haven't released any new findings, but I still have the Herald Sun, the ABC, 9 News all calling up, wanting to talk about the issue because we've developed enough energy and momentum around this topic now that they're making hooks into the issue from other things that they're reporting on as well. So that building the conversation has been really important. Another thing that we are now doing, we talked about the issue of schools, people have brought it up a few times, we're now engaging with teachers in schools. So over the last 12 months, we've been contacted by many teachers, secondary school teachers particularly geography teachers, but also more recently food studies teachers in Victoria, who wanted to use the project findings to teach aspects of their curriculum. And it turns out, which we didn't realise at the time, that there's a geography unit in Year 9 of the Australian curriculum, which is called Biomes and Food Security. It looks at food security issues and the impacts of population growth, climate pressures, constraints on environmental resources, and, best of all, it's one of 2 compulsory geography units that all students throughout the country take in Year 9. My own children did this unit last year and came home talking to us about the issues over the dinner table. So if we want to create conversations with the general public, we kind of thought, what better way than to have children talking to their parents about the issues because they're looking at that in the school curriculum. So we went back to the Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, we talked to them about the opportunity, and they have funded the development of curriculum resources based on the Foodprint Melbourne project. And we're launching those at the end of the year. So they're going to be ready for the start of the next school year. We work with the Geography Teachers Association of Victoria, so we've worked with a professional body who's been helping us to develop these resources. And the resources basically form a set of student worksheets, teacher instructions, and also we've made available some of our data so that through GIS mapping, so that students can actually be investigating what grows in Victoria, how much of different kinds of vegetables and fruits are produced in the food bowl area, in Melbourne's food bowl area, compared to other regional areas of Victoria. And you can see on that map there, it shows you some of the recycled water capacity. So we can also look at what's the recycled water capacity close to different kinds of growing areas as well. And we think that making this data more widely available is a great way of allowing people, and young people especially, to investigate the issues. We've also done a lot to try to engage the media. Media stories have been a very important part of our overall engagement strategy. So early on in our investigations of Melbourne's food bowl, we had some very productive conversations with a couple of interested state politicians who made it clear how important it was that we should be engaging the mainstream media, particularly the News Corp media, and for that, for us in Victoria is the Herald Sun as well as the Age, etc. In fact, I think the quote was, if it's in the Herald Sun, it's an issue, was what politicians told us, and that we should be doing talkback radio, etc. as well, so we've taken that on board. We had help from some of those politicians and their communications advisors to help us understand how to tell the story effectively. So there were times when we would sit with them and their communications advisors, we tell them the story, they translate the story for us into simple messages that help them. Really, it helped to train us, if you like, in talking to the public about the issues. We also then built up a small pool, I should be honest about that, a small pool of farmers who are willing to help us tell those stories. If you're going to tell stories, you need to have people to help you tell those stories. As researchers, we can't tell those stories by ourselves. That's been very challenging because farmers can be quite reluctant to speak up about those issues. It's obviously a very sensitive topic. Many farmers would like to retain the option to sell their land for housing. So it is quite difficult to find farmers, but we have been working on that, and these are some of the farmers that we've worked with as well. Very important to have people to help you tell your story. To engage stakeholders, we have to have highly accessible reports. Our reports are very heavy on images if you've looked at them, and that's quite deliberate. The images, we talked about the fact that we all connect on an emotional level. That's very true. The images are how we connect with people on an emotional level. Our reports are full of images of lush, beautiful fruit and vegetables, and I have to credit my 16-year-old son, who's the official project photographer, who took all the photos for us as we went out around the city and around farmers' markets. But those images say, why would you want to lose this? Why would you want to lose this beautiful, fresh food production? But they communicate in a way that our words can't do overall. So it makes them highly accessible. These project reports, when we last checked about a few months ago, 6 months ago, have been downloaded over 14,000 times. Our final report's the most downloaded report on the faculty website within the faculty that we were working in. So we've worked really hard to make those outputs accessible. We've had around 60,000 points of online engagement overall with this project in terms of comments on articles, social media, conversation articles, etc. That's another key lesson. We track all evidence of impact. We have an engagement strategy, we have a communication strategy that runs alongside this project, we have an impact report, and we're constantly tracking our impact in terms of the signs that people are engaging with the project and the signs that we're influencing others as well. That's how we quantify our impact, that's how we help secure future funding for the project. So it's been a really important part of this project to learn how to do that and how to demonstrate impact. And we produce short briefings, so 4 to 5 page briefings that we use particularly to communicate with policymakers. Journalists, I find, particularly keen to have that rather than the weighty report, and to communicate with ministers and their advisors as well. So the briefing is what I typically send out rather than the full weighty report. It's important to have them. So we've got to this stage where we're generating some momentum with stakeholders about the need to protect Melbourne's food bowl as a fundamental building block in a more sustainable, healthy, resilient food system for the city. How are we going to capitalise on that now? So last month we kicked off the next stage of the Foodprint Melbourne project, the project to develop a roadmap for a more resilient city food bowl. And I want to qualify some expectations about this next part of this presentation, in the sense that I can only, of course, tell you now what we're going to do, not how effective or successful it's been, and apologies in advance if it turns out to be a really bad idea, but this is what we're about to do. So we're going to work with stakeholders to develop a shared vision for Melbourne's food bowl, a roadmap of potential strategies for achieving that vision, and our scope includes these 5 broad policy objectives, and we're proposing to address them in a very integrated way. Now, we think that one of the reasons, there are many reasons why progress isn't being made on this issue, but we think that one of them is that the issues are currently being dealt with in a very fragmented way in individual policy silos. So as an example, Victorian planners currently lack a policy framework that would recognise that farmland close to water treatment plants is of very high strategic value in terms of the recycled water, which is very close to fertile farmland, because the policy framework is not making the connections between food security, water access, and land use. And I've had conversations where it became clear, actually, the minister at one point had asked some people in department to look at the issue, and they'd kind of called up and said, this is all very well, great, you've put this report out, and you've got us talking about the issues, but how am I meant to do this? Because my policy framework will not let me match up the land, the fertile land, with the water access. We've got some work to do to help people to make connections between those issues. So we want to build the capacity of stakeholders to work together on these problems in an integrated way, to develop their capacity for more integrated food systems thinking so that they can work together in an integrated way on potential solutions. So we intend to work across these policy silos, not within them. There's also been a lack of long-term planning to address the pressures on the city's food supply from climate change and from the declining supplies of all those natural resources that underpin food production. So, as an example, at the moment in Victoria, farmers' demand for recycled water is often assessed by asking them what their immediate needs are for water and what they're prepared to pay for recycled water now, rather than exploring what the longer-term impacts are likely to be of climate change on the availability of that water, on food prices, and how farmers are likely to respond in the longer term as those circumstances change. So we're going to develop scenarios that explore potential future challenges and their impact on food supply. So this is our process that we're going to use. Basically, we're going to start with a set of stakeholder interviews, go out and talk to our stakeholders about the likely policy barriers to achieving this and the likely opportunities as well. And that'll be a very broad range of stakeholders. I won't talk about the details now. We're also going to do a review of the policies that are influencing this issue at state and local government level, and look again for barriers and opportunities. We're going to talk to some international cities that we think are doing a really great job on this issue, look at their policies, and also have a chat to them about how they've addressed the opportunities and barriers. And we're going to publish an interim report after the first phase, which really outlines for all the stakeholders what the differences are in their perspectives on the issue, how all of them see the issue. And then we're going to take all this data and go into a set of workshops with stakeholders where we work with them collaboratively using scenario planning techniques, where we're looking at scenarios about how these challenges are going to affect food supply. We also think it's really important to create a national conversation. I want to finish by re-identifying a few opportunities here. We think one of the opportunities is to create a national conversation about this issue. There are now teams working in several states on the issue, in Victoria, New South Wales, people in Sydney, etc. as well. There's an opportunity to move beyond our state-based work, to be learning from each other and to be amplifying the conversation by making it a national conversation. So over the next 12 months, we're going to look for opportunities to do that on the Foodprint Melbourne project. We also think there's a really good opportunity here for us to all leverage international policy frameworks. These issues we're talking about are not common only to Australia. Same issues in cities around the world. Peter already talked about the UNFAO is doing some work. They've released recently, just in the last couple of weeks, a new city region food system toolkit with some tools and techniques and processes that have been trialled in different cities around the world that cities could be using, could be leveraging, and we're going to be looking more closely at this framework in the next stage of the Foodprint Melbourne project, and I encourage you to have a look at that. Also think about leveraging the other policies that are around you. So in Melbourne, one of the policies that we've leveraged is the City of Melbourne's food policy. So they've already set a vision for what we want the food policy of the city to look like. We've hooked into that vision and tried to leverage the policies that were around us. Here in Perth, you've probably got opportunities as well in terms of existing policies to be kind of hooking into and to be leveraging. Try and leverage them where you can. And lastly, I just want to finish by saying, this is really complex work, very challenging. It's a wicked problem in the true sense, of the term. It's been decades in the making, and it's going to take some time to solve. So I really think about our advocacy on this issue in terms of decades rather than months or years. I've been working on this issue myself since about 2010. I think I'll be working on it for a long time to come. But as complex as it is, for me, it comes down really to one simple question. Do we think that it's important that our children and our grandchildren should be able to continue to buy and eat locally grown fresh food in the future? If the answer to that question is yes, then despite all the complexity, then we do need to act to look at how we plan our cities in a different way, to look at how we support our farmers in a different way. And it's been really absolute pleasure to come here and to see people here in Perth really taking steps to address those issues and to plan your food future differently. I'll leave it there. Thank you.